Welcome to the Leadership Zone. I'm your host, Sheila Walsh, Leadership Development Specialist, Coach and Researcher.
Is that when we think of diversity, most people think about diversity as something different to that, right? So when somebody says to me, oh, what's your diversity? I'll usually say woman because I'm white. And I know that's being normalized as the dominant norm. When you think of inclusion and you only think of it as including people different to a white male, you're actually still working off exploitive kind of norm. So the issue is that inclusion actually includes everybody. So inclusion includes white men, it includes white women, it includes people of color, it includes able-bodied people, disabled people, it includes neurodiverse people, neurodivergent. But one of the challenges with it is that the other identities that are marginalized or deprioritized next to white norms or white male norms often have to fight to be heard, seen and valued in a room where there's a dominant male white norm. And so what happens is that a lot of the time we're rejecting that identity, are getting really frustrated because they're feeling unimportant, deprioritized, like they don't belong in these spaces anymore. But the thing is, inclusion means that actually we all belong because we all have intersectional identity. So when we think about inclusion, we have to think about intersectionality, which is all the parts of our identity. But we also have to understand that we have parts of our identity that give us an unfair advantage over other people. What we have to do is we have to think about not just did we work hard, because most people work hard. So for me, inclusion has to be that we all belong in the space, but we have to understand the power that we have in that space and how we may be being given privilege or advantage over others. Even if we don't know it, we have to be willing for others to tell us, because none of us know our own privilege. Someone has to tell us because it's our norm. And we think that it's other people's normal experience, usually. When we think about inclusion, we need to think about bringing all of that into the mix. We can't ignore our privilege, but we also, by acknowledging our privilege, we can acknowledge our disadvantage without getting into oppressive Olympics. And so inclusion has to be all of it, but it means that we have to look at something and allow it to be true, even if we don't want it to be true that it's advantaging us. So, because if we don't acknowledge that, inclusion can't happen, because whenever you come into the space where there's lots of different identities, you're going to act out the power imbalances that exist because you're ignoring one of the powers, which is your presentation makes you more palatable for success than other presentations, whether it's gender, disability, race, ethnicity. So if you can't acknowledge that, whenever you come into inclusion spaces, you're actually going to cause harm and you're going to find it really hard to be in that space. But equally, if you think inclusion is just about the other, you're not going to feel safe in that space either. So change can't happen if some people aren't in the room. But what we want is that when you're in the room, you know that you have disadvantages, but advantages. And if people can own where they have advantages in the room where we're all being inclusive, then you can actually be part of the solution. One of the issues that a lot of inclusion movements are having issues with is that when people walk into the room who have advantages and they don't acknowledge it, they dominate the room. And they don't even know they're doing it because they're used to being important and being heard. But inclusion has to be intersectional identity, which is you are more than just a white man, but the fact you're a white man matters too. That will have an advantage. But we also have to acknowledge you have other things at play that might be disadvantages in your experience that disadvantage you against another white man. Yeah, we have to think bigger than the other being different. And we realize actually all of us are diverse. We have multiple parts to our identity that is at play every day. And that if we can think that way, I think we're going to create a lot more buy-in from people who have that advantage. Whereas I think when we reject those people as only that advantage, which is also oppressive because they're more than that presentation, they're more than that advantage. Yeah, you create this tension where, in my experience, white men are having a really difficult time understanding this, because actually a lot of the time when they're in the conversations, they're being blamed rather than being walked through understanding their advantages and bringing out their compassion to it. The majority of men that I meet do want to know, but they have a very limited sense of their own identity sometimes. So they're really careful and they're really conscious that people might take that away from them. And so it creates a reaction. Whereas for me, inclusion has to be everyone and all of everyone. And it has to be about understanding power and how we automatically have power. Doesn't need to be thrown out. But if his competence in inclusion is limited and he is not willing to do that work, then maybe he doesn't deserve his place. And that's different to throwing someone out. That's saying you are in a leadership position, you are expected to lead in something, and your inability to grow here is actually what's removing you from your position. And I think that a lot of the people coming up through the ranks now are brought up in more of a social justice understanding and understand inclusion better. So like there's a lot more understanding coming up through the ranks. So senior leaders, for the first time, we have intergenerational workplace like we've never had it before. Senior leaders have juniors who have more knowledge in certain things than they do. That's very threatening when your position has been based on being the hero leader, having all the knowledge. So I think that one of the things that is required of senior leaders is to actually look at this properly. It does have traction. Some organizations are so invested because they know it benefits their bottom line, and that it does, like, but also other organizations are actually designed oppressively. Only certain people from certain universities are promoted. Only certain people in certain clubs are promoted. So these things, these gates into promotion are being challenged now. And so those organizations are resisting and holding. And I see a lot of men in positions of power now believed that there was a straight line to success for them, and they got it. So they don't understand how somebody doesn't have a straight line to success. And they might say, oh, I worked really hard. And they probably did, because I'm not saying that success doesn't mean you don't work hard, but you might not have worked as hard as your peers with different identities did. And they may not have got the same results for the same effort. And I think that's what we need to think about. So some organizations are embracing it. Some organizations are being tokenistic about it, like sending people on inclusion training, but aren't actually changing the systems which inherently keep exclusion and oppressive systems as norm. Some organizations are like saying all the right stuff, have lots of like liberalism built into them, but actually aren't developing their people to understand what's really happening. Like inclusion is really, really complex. And I want to say this because people say to me, they never think it's possible. I actually don't. Inclusion isn't about ticking a box, getting somewhere that we can say it's done. Inclusion is a practice. It's a little bit like going to the gym. It's like saying, oh, but we'll never have the perfect body and it will be sustainable. No, because you have to keep going to the gym to sustain it. Inclusion is that. Inclusion is not like a tick box, which I think sometimes the diversity agenda has become, is like, oh, well, we have a diverse workforce. Tick. Are they performing? Are you supporting them? Are they growing? Are they getting into leadership positions? Because we know that, and I hate to do the triangle image, but we know that the further up in organizations in Ireland and the UK that you go, the whiter and the more male it becomes. We know that. So if your organization is diverse, is the diversity stuck at the bottom? Because if it is, it means inclusion isn't happening. Anti-oppressive inclusion isn't happening. It means that those at top haven't actually grown to understand how to be inclusive, how to practice inclusion, and how to create performance and results through inclusion. And that's kind of where I really focus, is that inclusion is about how we do things, but it's still about doing things. We still want good results. We know that the more diverse your board is, actually, we've seen an increase in revenue from that. We know that there's better turnover when you have a diverse board, but not just sitting a person on the board and saying, now we've got a diverse board. You have to be influenced by that person. And that means that the people who were taught unconsciously not to be influenced by anything other than their other white male colleagues aren't going to be influenced by the diversity around them. And what I mean by diversity in that sense is by people different to that image. Yeah. So what we have to do is we have to help people to understand that inclusion is actually a practice of performance, as well as, so I think it's complex. I don't think it's a result. I think it's a practice, but it's really hard to say to someone who honestly believes that they've worked really hard to where they've got to, and they have, to say that part of why they're there is because of their identity. It's really hard for people to hear that, because it shakes their narrative about themselves. And that's why we all need support. Actually born into systems that are naturally oppressive. And what I mean by that is the system gives power to certain groups and preferences power to certain groups, right? And so we've all been brought into oppressive systems, and we don't, like, that's our norm. That's what we take for granted. We don't necessarily have a different system that we've seen. Like even capitalism, it has an oppression to it, obviously, because some of us win, some of us lose in it inherently, you know, not because of generally just how hard we work. So when you're creating these systems and organizations, you are unconsciously going to repeat oppression, even when you're trying to be inclusive. And I think that the ultimate practice of inclusion is looking at how do I include people and how am I unconsciously excluding people? And if I can do that, then inclusion can be a living practice, because we're looking at how to undo what isn't working and how to add what is working. It only wants to like add interventions, but it's not addressing the fact that, you know, it talks about being an equal employer, but actually somebody in a wheelchair can't get into the building. That's an oppressive thing that they're looking away from. Or it says it's inclusive, but somebody with neurodiversity can't work there because they need loads of noise or they need loads of quiet and the environment doesn't supply that. So like, we have to also look at what we're not doing for inclusion to work, not just or what we're doing that limits certain people accessing it, as well as what we can do to keep people included. You're going to come across a lot of issues if you're not also addressing the oppressive norms that are there. Like if the top of your senior leadership are very male and very white, but your entry level aren't, you have inbuilt oppression and you don't know where it is. And you've got to work on that. You've replicated something that preferences a certain type of oppression. If you have entry bodies of neurodiverse people, but the further up you go, you don't, or you have a great entry level of people with all sorts of disabilities and abilities, but actually the further up you don't. And like, none of us have all those answers, right? So this is the point. It's not about saying, oh, I'm so terrible because we have this. It's about saying, I see it and I'm going to address it. See it, do something. It's rather than see it, avoid it, which is a defense that we have towards anything that might not look good about us, either individually as organizations. We like to look away from things that challenge our idea of ourselves being good and positive. To create true inclusion, all of us need to be able to see how we have an unfair advantage to people or are disadvantaging people unfairly. So the organization need to look at that, and we need to look at what we can do to be more inclusive. Yeah, so that's a really common question. So I have two things. So two things. Let me say, even the notion that we're successful is interesting. Successful, or are we very ego-driven? So I always put that question on people, because there's an assumption that because we're dominating the world that we're successful. But actually, if you look at it, we harm the world more than any other species. We are actually moving our own species most near to extinction than any other species is in the world. I put a question there. Are we successful, right? That's my first one.
Yeah.
And then my second one is, I think it is an evolution of how we are towards each other. You know, I think this is like a social evolution, right? That's what I think it is. We're all built, like there's an unconscious bias that we all want to be around people the same as us. Like that is true, right? We all do that. But one of the issues is that we've actually said that some groups of people are more deserving than others. That's been human inflict. Like we've done that. That has been socially, like we've done that to people. We've done it to people so that we feel special, so that we can contain power, so that we have advantages. Partially ties into capitalism. Before capitalism, there was other social norms that existed. It partially ties into heteronormative marriages, where you got married so you'd split the wealth, but the wealth was always passed down through the male line, given to the man, but passed from man to man. So like, there's all these systemic things that are invisible, but very visible if you think about it. So we're outgrowing that. But unfortunately, what that does is it means that it challenges people to look at themselves and question themselves. That's hard, right? Like that's hard to do. But it's no different to any other, we'll say, social evolutions that have occurred. I don't necessarily think it's a biological, and I know people argue the biological stuff all the time. I think that a lot of the biological norms are rooted in these social norms, but people don't always understand how it comes back to that. So like there are things that we label as biological that are originally built on an assumption that is a social norm or is about a social norm. So from my point of view, it's no different to learning to eat with utensils or learning to poop in the toilet. Being inclusive is a practice that is better for society and for its people. Being exclusive and continuing the oppressive norms is better for a certain group of people. And that's where there is resistance, there is a fear we're going to lose power. And there is a fear that we won't hold the position we hold now. And I would say that, yes, that is threatening, but actually in an inclusive system, you'll hold a position. It'll just be equal. That's not something to be frightened of. It's a lot of the fear about losing power is because you're still thinking that there's an oppressive norm. And so you'll be below. Whereas what I'm talking about in terms of an inclusive system rather than an oppressive system is that we flatline. This stuff is complex because that also contradicts a lot around capitalism, which is where a lot of the West is built on, a lot of individualism. But if you look at other parts of the world or other norms, collectivism is normalized, and you'll see a different way of managing. So a lot of people who resist these changes, I think, aren't aware that they're functioning within oppressive systems, and they see themselves as losing a position, going under someone, and they fear that, as opposed to what I'm talking about is actually, if you create a system that's fair and that people have equal opportunities and that there isn't unfair advantages, then actually you don't need to fear, because you just still get to thrive. You just don't get to have power over people. Shore et al. Is doing this research and has talked about this, which is really good inclusion in groups. What we all need is a sense of individuality and belonging. So this is what a lot of bad inclusion work does, which is says we're all the same. But actually, inclusion is saying we are all different and have something really valuable to add. So let me be individual and belong. And so that's an inclusive system that we're trying to create. So you don't need to be scared of that, because you're still going to be special in your own right and contribute. You just won't have power over people through unfair advantage. You will actually be there in your own right and deserve your place there.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Zone. We can continue this conversation over on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @SheilaWalsh1, or at LinkedIn, you'll find me under Sheila Walsh. To book a free consultation to discuss your leadership needs or the leadership development needs of your organisation, simply visit my website www.sheilawalsh.com and book a free leadership consultation. I look forward to hearing from you.